So welcome back. We're going to have a look at the second part of this Jekyll and Hyde paper. So it's English Literature Paper 2, the 19th Century Novel and Poetry. And we are looking at the whole text section of the Jekyll and Hyde question. Thinking about this question, we are looking at the part B, because we've already had a go at part A in the earlier video. So this time we're looking for how Henry Jekyll talks about bad behaviour. All right, so we're looking at explaining how bad behaviour is explored elsewhere in the novel. You have these two bullet points which you can use, but it does say must, but you don't actually have to. They are there to guide you and to help you. This section of the question is worth 20 marks. So in total, your Jekyll and Hyde question is worth 40 marks, which is half of the marks on this paper. One of my top tips for you as an examiner on this paper is to consider what the question actually means. So if we're thinking about how bad behaviour is explored, bad as an adjective perhaps isn't particularly high level. We want to look at something a little bit more sophisticated. So really quickly, I have just considered synonyms for bad, and I've thought about evil, wicked, corrupt, nefarious, sinful, and immoral. You might not have heard of the word nefarious before. It basically means really, really wicked or really evil. So it's quite a nice, sophisticated vocabulary there for you. And I've actually used that in my model answer later on, so you can see how that would work. So by now, you know, I'm going to remind you about our 4 magic letters, which spell out EDAC, and I'm going to remind you what we're looking for in relation to this question. So as we start, we think about our E, our established. So how does Stevenson establish the idea of bad behaviour? What does that look like at the start of the novella? What ideas are associated with bad behaviour? And also, more importantly, why? Why does Stevenson create these ideas around people behaving badly? We're then going to think about our develop. So thinking about how these ideas about bad behaviour are developed, what perhaps is connected to bad behaviour, what other ideas emerge from that initial bad behaviour. Just talking about bad behaviour is going to get you into that grade 4-5, but we want to move beyond that and have a look at what that reveals about humanity. We're thinking about that when we come to amplify. So what themes are amplified through this bad behaviour? What is Stevenson connecting to these ideas, and how does he show his readers that? And then lastly, as the novel concludes, you know, how does this bad behaviour affect people? What does he want his readers to consider in relation to this type of behaviour? So why write a novel which includes people behaving badly? What does he want us to learn from that and take forwards in our own lives? Thinking about how I would introduce this idea of bad behaviour then, Stevenson opens the novel with this story that Mr. Enfield narrates to Mr. Utterson right at the start, where he's coming back from the end of the world at 3 o'clock in the morning and witnesses a small stumpy man bump into a young, innocent 8 to 10-year-old girl on the streets, and he tramples calmly over her and leaves her screaming on the ground. So the first instance of incredibly bad behaviour, evil, sadistic, violent behaviour. But perhaps what is more interesting is the way that people react to this bad behaviour. So in the moment, Mr. Enfield describes how the presence of Mr. Hyde brought the sweat out on me like running. So he's got this very strong reaction. He sort of brings out his sweats. He's kind of frightened. His adrenaline is pumping. His heart's pounding just with the mere presence of Mr. Hyde. You've got the doctor, who is the usual cut and dry type. He's about as emotional as a bagpipe. And he's turned sick and white with the desire to kill Mr. Hyde. So again, a really strong, intense reaction to the presence of Mr. Hyde in the novel. And the women, with this lovely little mythological reference to harpies, they're described as wild as harpies, as Mr. Enfield and the other men that are there are having to like restrain these women because they are so angry at what has happened. They're so disgusted and frightened by this evil behavior that they're kind of out of control. They're described as wild. So very, very strong reactions to this bad behavior that's introduced to us right at the start of the novel. So a nice paragraph to introduce the reader and the examiner to your response, talking about how bad behaviour is demonstrated through this violence, but then people's reaction to bad behaviour. So, if we consider what happens next, I think it's quite a nice point to put in a further established. The behaviour here is really contrasted with the Victorian standards, and the response to Hyde's initial bad behaviour is to consider how they can best punish him. They've said that killing is out of the question, obviously, because that's bad behaviour and they're not allowed to do that, it's against the law. But he says that, Mr. Enfield says when he's narrating this, that we did the next best. They told Mr. Hyde that they could and would make such a scandal out of this as should make his name stink from one end of London to the other. And that's a really interesting response to bad behaviour, this idea of reputation. So, very early on in the novel, the idea of behaviour and reputation are very closely linked. And that's where our why comes in. Bad behaviour is shown to damage your reputation, which in Victorian society would mean that you were socially ostracised and you would be unable to live, you'd be unable to do anything. Victorian society operates on the idea of credit, and your credit is tied to your reputation. So if you can't get credit, then you can't go into the clubs, you can't go into the social spaces, and therefore you would be completely outside of society. And so this really is a stark warning right at the start about what could happen to Jekyll and what will happen to Jekyll as his behaviour deteriorates throughout the novel. And this kind of hangs over the novel in all aspects. The fact that reputation and behaviour are so intrinsically linked, that it provides a moral code on how to act. Looking at then how these ideas begin to develop throughout the novel, when I was sitting thinking about how I would respond to this question, I think for me, bad behaviour is really developed through the idea of secrecy. And I'm going to have a look across the novel at where that comes in. So in chapter 2, we then consider this mysterious will and this perhaps introduction of the idea of blackmail. We've got Jekyll's secretive behaviour. For example, he's refuses entry to Utterson into his house. He kind of falls away from society, which, as I've just mentioned, is a really important, terrible thing. He's got this mysterious fallout with Lanyon. There's the darkness and the fog, and then of course there's the setting. So in terms of that bad behaviour and how it's developed, the idea of secrecy tied to reputation again and bad behaviour becomes incredibly important. Let's break this down then. So thinking about the mysterious will, if I've picked out 3 quotes for you to have a look at that you can use. The introduction, so the actual clause of the will: in case of Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence, Edward Hyde should step into Henry Jekyll's shoes without further delay. The document, the will, has long been the lawyer's eyesore. It offended Mr. Utterson as a lawyer and as a lover of the sane and customary sides of life. And in terms of how he thinks about this will, he considers it as madness. And he puts it back in the safe and said, now I begin to fear it's disgrace. And that last little bit there, I fear it is disgrace, introduces the idea of blackmail. It introduces the idea of there is something that is wrong. There's something that is very concerning about this will. And so this sense of the unknown element of this bad behaviour is quite frightening to a reader. There is something very wrong. However, we're not sure what it is, but we know that it's linked to something which is probably corrupt, or something which definitely needs to be considered. We've then got Jekyll's secretive behaviour developing further. So this idea of him closeting himself away and removing himself from society. When Utterson goes to visit Jekyll, he's turned away by Paul, who's Jekyll's butler, who says that the doctor was confined to the house and saw no one. And Mr. Utterson keeps trying. He tried again and was again refused. And after having been seeing his friend for the last 2 months, almost daily, he found this return to solitude to weigh upon his spirits. So Utterson is concerned. He's worried that Jekyll's behaviour is not appropriate. He's worried about his friend has got himself into something that is going to be his undoing. So linking this idea of Jekyll becoming more reclusive, the fact that he's becoming more secretive, is linked to bad behaviour within Victorian society. And again, in this second quotation I've got there for you, the doctor, it appeared now more than ever, confined himself to the cabinet over the laboratory, where he would sometimes even sleep. He was out of spirits. He'd grown very silent. He did not read. It seemed as if he had something on his mind. So there's a real vague ambiguity to what's going on here. There's a confusion over what is actually wrong with Jekyll. And because we don't know, as a reader at this point, we don't know what's happening, that link to poor behaviour becomes more and more concerning. We've then, of course, got this all steeped in the darkness and the fog. The novella opens with Mr. Enfield narrating the fact that he was coming back from some place at the end of the world, and it was about 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm not sure about you, but I don't think going out at 3 o'clock in the morning and roaming the streets is something which is linked to positive or reputable behaviour. So the chances are that whatever he's doing is perhaps linked with poor behaviour. We've then got the sense of this motif of the fog that runs throughout the novel. So a fog rolled over the city in the small hours, the light falling dimly through the foggy cupola, even in the houses the fog began to lie thickly. And in literature, we always see this idea of fog linked with secrecy because it acts as a blanket. It covers the poor behaviour that is happening within society. And this, of course, is then linked with the actual setting itself. So again, early in the morning, when the characters come across this certain sinister block of building, the fact that it has no windows, again emphasizing secrecy. Nobody can look in, nobody can see out what's going on. There's nothing but a door, but on that door there's neither bell nor knocker. The house itself has got marks of prolonged and sordid negligence. It was blistered and disdained. So all ideas of a place which is irreputable, something which has got a poor reputation. And if we have poor reputation, we link that with poor behaviour. So we've got a lot there that we can explore with and develop. My advice to you is not to try to cover all of this. You do only have half an hour for your writing. So consider which bits of this that you feel most confident writing about when you're going to give this a little practice when you finish watching this video. So thinking about why, in terms of the setting and the fog and the secrecy, it reveals these characters know their behaviour is nefarious and immoral. They must hide their behaviour in order to preserve their reputation. However, Stephen suggests evil behaviour will always be discovered. And there's that use of that word nefarious there for you, so you can see how you can use that in your response. When I think about how bad behaviour is amplified through the novel, what pops out for me is this idea of Jekyll's scientific experimentation. This is one of the key themes that is linked to bad behaviour and really is the purpose of this novel. Ultimately, Stevenson's showing that science goes against God and is therefore immoral. And this kind of horror and ultimately death that is caused from this scientific experimentation. So looking at the idea of science and how that amplifies bad behaviour across the novel, one of the first things to look at is Jekyll's scientific background. We know that Lanyon says that Jekyll hasn't seen him for more than 10 years because he became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind. And then he goes on to say, I see and I have seen devilish little of the man, such unscientific balderdash. So linking this idea of science, reputation, poor behaviour, creating this sense of science being something to be very worried about, the idea of science being linked to moral corruption, perhaps. And then you've got the description of Jekyll's laboratory. The actual laboratory itself is described as dingy. It's a windowless structure, seeing that motif of windows again with the idea of things being hidden and secrecy. Utterson comments on the sense of strangeness that he feels as he goes in there. The tables themselves were laden with chemical apparatus. The floor is strewn with crates and littered with packing straw. This sense of unrefinement, this sense of people being wild or out of control, the sense of things, people not caring about appearance, which in Victorian society would be linked to poor behaviour because your reputation, as I keep saying, is so important. And if you do anything that is deemed as bad, then you would be ostracised from society. Furthermore, Utterson describes how the room was large and it's fitted with glass presses, furnished among other things with a cheval glass and a business table, and looking out upon the court by 3 dusty windows barred with iron. this sense of something and some secret being held in and contained and imprisoned in the laboratory. So connecting this idea of poor behavior with science, with secrets, and with reputation. You've then got it really amplified through the creation of this potion and what that's like. Remembering that in the Victorian era itself, science is advancing at a real great, it's a time of innovation, it's a time of expanse and experimentation. But with that comes a real fear. And so when we look at the kind of the scientific semantic field that's used across the novella, the potion being created is a moment of fear. So it's described as how he measured out a few minims of the red tincture and added one of the powders. The mixture began to brighten in colour, to effervesce audibly, and to throw off small fumes of vapour. Suddenly, at the same moment, the ebullition ceased and the compound changed to a dark purple, which faded again more slowly to a watery green. You've then got, I compounded the elements, watched them boil and smoke together in a glass. So really this sense of almost like a witch-like potion, this idea of almost magic happening through the science, and something that's incredibly frightening. This Jekyll describes himself as transcendental medicine, moving beyond the realms of our known understanding, of our known knowledge, into the unknown, which, as you know from all of your texts that we've looked at, is incredibly frightening. The first time that Lanyon watches the transformation, he watches Hyde at that point put the glass to his lips and drank. A cry followed. He reeled, staggered, clutched at the table and held on, staring with injected eyes, gasping with open mouth. So this kind of real fear around what is happening and what the potential of science has. This is not described as something which is good behavior, and therefore we have to consider the fact that this is really bad behavior. This is evil, this is immoral, this is depraved. There's lots of wonderful words we can use to describe that, and it creates this real sense of terror within the reader. And the effects of this scientific experimentation, when Utterson goes back to visit Lanyon after, as we as readers know, Lanyon has witnessed this transformation, Utterson remarks how he was shocked at the change which had taken place in the doctor's appearance. He had his death warrant written upon his face. The rosy man had grown pale. His flesh had fallen away. He was visibly bolder and older. And Lanyon himself has described how watching this transformation caused him to leap back against the wall in terror, his arms raised to shield him. His mind is submerged in terror, and he calls out to God. "Oh God," I screamed, and "Oh God," again and again. So this sense of this science and this scientific experimentation being terrifying, the bad behavior here and the effect it has on Lanyon is really frightening in this moment of the novel. As you conclude talking about those quotations again, just pick out the ones that work for you. You might not have time to cover them all, so thinking about which ones you're going to be able to write confidently about. But thinking about why is science linked to bad behaviour, it really reflects the contemporary fears of science. It amplifies and reveals the dangers of breaking away from religious ideology and the kind of anarchy and immorality that will ensue if we don't have this kind of spiritual or religious framework. Then what do we have left? And Stevenson's really amplifying that through the bad behaviour that's linked to science throughout this novella. Stevenson concludes the novella with the full revelation of Jekyll's behaviour and really the selfish motivation behind why he behaves in the way that he does. His full testament, chapter 10 of the novella, reveals that this kind of desire to behave badly and the immorally and debased and all these kind of evil thoughts and feelings actually reside in us all. He reveals to us that Mr. Hyde's deeds are more frighteningly the glee that he has in them, and a link to this kind of bad behavior throughout the novella. And also then finally he just ends with this idea of the consequences of this bad behavior. Yes, it is about reputation. Yes, it is about your standing within society. But actually, if you continue to indulge in this kind of debauchery and debased behavior, that actually you are damning your soul. A bit like what we've seen in Macbeth, with how as soon as Macbeth has committed that regicide, his soul has been corrupted and he's been damned to eternal hell. Looking at giving you a bit of guidance then, if we take those three kind of elements, there's this sense in the final chapter of how Jekyll indulges in this bad behavior. So he talks about the reasons why he has concealed his pleasures. So hence it came about that I concealed my pleasures. And then when I reached years of reflection and began to look around me and take stock of my progress and position in the world, I stood already committed to a profound duplicity of life. And it's that sense of having to repress those more base instincts within us that cause this kind of conflict. And you've seen these ideas before. So we've seen in Macbeth how this desperate need to be loved, this desperate need to be respected and to be a good character, um, compete with this unchecked ambition, with this sense that he wants the power. We saw it in Jack in Lord of the Flies when he desperately wants to kill the pig at the start. He can't because of the unbearable blood. But then once he's painted his face, he's liberated from shame and self-consciousness. And this is what Jekyll's really kind of trying to explore. So Stevenson reveals that Jekyll's got this kind of duality, this sense of irreconcilable kind of tearing of himself apart by knowing that he needs to behave in a reputable good way, but also having all of these evil desires within himself. And when he finally, paints his face, creates Hyde, he laid aside restraint and plunged into shame. And those similar concepts, like I've said, that we see in Lord of the Flies, this idea of being able to hide the good side, the side that has to be moral, that has to be part of civilized society, and able then to plunge into somewhere where you are freed from those things. He talks about the pleasures which I made haste to seek in my disguise were, as I have said, undignified. All right, so he knows that what he wants to do are not acceptable. It's not moral behavior. He talks about in the hands of Edward Hyde, these pleasures soon began to turn towards the monstrous. So once we've indulged in those pleasures, and we can really draw the allusions to what happens to Jack in Lord of the Flies. Once Jack's managed to kill that pig for the first time, there's no stopping him. That then escalates and it becomes not just killing a pig for meat, but for the pleasure of it. And then that becomes escalated further, where they kill Simon, albeit by accident. But by the end, they're chasing Ralph across the island with a stick sharpened at both ends in wanton murder. And we see this in Jekyll and Hyde too. We see the fact that once he's indulged in these small pleasures, it escalates and he's all of a sudden, craving these kind of evil, nefarious behaviors. He talks about how he was often plunged in a kind of wonder at my vicarious depravity. So actually, he's kind of amazed by this poor behavior. He's kind of delighted by it, which, as a reader, is really quite unsettling, quite frightening. And then the quote that probably a lot of you do know, my devil had been long caged, he came out roaring. So this sense of once we free ourselves from the kind of oppression of reputation, once we allow those feelings that we have repressed for so long to come to the surface, there's this kind of a real monstrous sense of evil that comes out, this kind of this devil within inside us all. And as I've just said, Jekyll talks about how he really enjoys this behavior as Hyde. He talks about how the spirit of hell awoke in me and raged, but with a transport of glee. So this is when Jekyll's talking about how he's killed Sir Danvers Carew, and he talks about how he mauled the unresisting body and how he tasted delight from every blow. And I think for me there, that idea of tasting delight is really frightening. This sense of this bad behavior being something that can bring us pleasure is something that I think Stevenson is very worried about. And of course, at the end of the novella, Stevenson can't just kind of talk about how bad behavior is a good thing. So he talks about the consequences of this. There comes an end to all things. He talks about how the condescension of my evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. He talks about how he had been safe of all men's respect. He was wealthy, he was beloved, but now he's the common quarry of mankind. He's a known murderer and he's a thrall for the gallows. So his earthly kind of consequences, in this sense of he can no longer be himself, the fact that he's so bound up in this evil action that the consequences are damning him both on earth. There is no option, there's no redemption, there's nothing that he can do, like we see in Macbeth at the end when he's the black tyrant and you know his sole name blisters our tongue. We know that with Macbeth he ends and there's no hope for him. We know here that there is no hope, there is no redemption for Jekyll at this point, either on earth or in the afterlife. And so the last bit to talk about really is the why again. So why does Stevenson write a novel about bad behavior? Why does he do all of these things? Well, really he's warning the readers of the kind of the damning consequences of this bad behavior, both within society and eternally. What's really interesting is Stevenson had a very strict Calvinist upbringing, which is very, very intense. And as he grew older, he actually rejected the kind of the church system. Although he remained deeply spiritual, he did believe that religion was important as a moral framework. He felt that without belief, human behavior would deteriorate. And so really what we're seeing here is this break away from religion, this break away from the church and towards science gives us no moral framework. And if we don't have that, then humanity itself will collapse, society will collapse. So now we've just looked at a basic EDAC response. Hopefully if you go through my video, you can pause it at various different points and help you construct your essay response. Remember, you can't refer to the extract. So we don't know what that extract is going to be. So I have included little bits from it, but in the exam, you can't talk about the extract because you've already talked about that. So you need to show your knowledge of the text outside of that. You don't need to explain context, but you'll see that throughout this video I've referred to it because it can help you interpret your ideas and meanings. It'd be very difficult to write about Jekyll and Hyde in a vacuum. A lot of it responds to the societal issues of the time. And lastly, you've got 30 minutes maximum for this section. And I've covered a lot more than you will probably be able to write in that 30 minutes. So pick the bits that you need. You need to cover at least 3 different sections of the text. So thinking about which bits of the developed and amplified work for you, and have fun practicing.